hopefully everyone can easily see this and um, you're all excited to be here to talk about HR, which is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. And I want to thank Joy for inviting me to come and meet with all of you today. As she mentioned, I do have some experience working in HR, but I have been managing people since I was 19 years old. I know who thought that was a good idea, but someone did when I worked in bookstores. And I never received any formal management training. I was just kind of told, you're in charge and expected to just know. And that was very frustrating to me. And so I now have been managing people for more than half of my life and have learned many things, but also still feel like there is still so much more to learn. And I'm here today to hopefully help you all feel like you add some tools to your own HR toolkits and hopefully get a good solid understanding about some of the things we can do as managers and leaders to set ourselves up for success. And so while you've already learned about me, I would love to know who we have here with us today. If you want to go ahead and just toss in the chat where you are from, maybe are you currently a manager? Do you want to become a manager? Are you a trustee? If there is anything you're hoping to learn over the next week in our sessions, I would love to hear about that as well. And so I'll just be monitoring the chat as Joy and Kevin mentioned. Joy and Kevin will also be checking in, but go ahead and just share in the chat. I can obviously see your name, but what library you're from, what your position is, and if there's one thing you're hoping to learn in these sessions, I'd love to know about that as well. And my hope is that we can have a very interactive session. Please don't hesitate to type stuff into the chat. If you have questions, we also have a separate Q&A that we're setting up that will be next week. So if you have more in-depth questions that we don't get to, we'll have plenty of time to talk about those there as well. Um, and it looks like we have people from trustees as well as staff, library chairs. Wonderful. It's great to see people that want to become, um, don't manage anyone yet, but hope to have a manager role someday. That's great. I'm seeing some school librarians as well, some library directors, people wanting to be a director. Great. So I think we have a really good mix of people here today, which is wonderful. And while I am here presenting, I want all of you to know that you also have knowledge, and I hope that you'll use this as an opportunity to share with others as well some of the things that you might know and have learned in your own work being both an employee and manager. Um, it's excited to have all of you here and talking about. I see a lot about motivation and handling difficult situations and tensions, and that certainly is something that we're going to be touching on and can go more in depth in as we get into different areas. So let's talk about what actually we're going to be covering for the next hour and a half. So this first session is going to be all about laying the foundation. And really, from my perspective, when we talk about HR, what we really want to talk about is how we can set ourselves up for success overall. And that means a couple things. For me, job descriptions. This is a thing that is so critically important and ties into everything that we do as a library. And so we're going to talk about how do you write a good job description and why that matters in every other area related to the life cycle of an employee. Then we're going to turn to talking about policies. Policies are also really important and have in terms of creating a good HR infrastructure. You want to tell your employees what you expect from them and also what they can expect from you as the employer. And then there's a lot of laws that relate to HR. And so we want to talk about what are some of those important laws that everyone should be aware of. And then what are some of the common legal issues that come up in HR and how do you navigate that? Because it can be really scary, especially if it's the first time that you're navigating something. Then next week, we're going to turn to how do you actually, once you have your strong foundation, how do you actually hire and train staff? And then, of course, the flip side, while we hope that people will stay and we'll have a great staff that stays for a long time, we also want to talk about what do we need to do when it's time to say goodbye? Sometimes it's us saying goodbye because someone is not performing or there are um, performance issues, but sometimes it is more about someone maybe retiring or moving to another library or getting a director or management role and moving elsewhere. So we're going to go through how to deal with challenging employee situations and also how to say farewell and talking about offboarding. And then we're going to have a whole session that's just dedicated to talking about some of those thornier issues. And this is a chance for all of you to bring some of those issues and answer, and talk through different scenarios of things that you have going on at your libraries. Um, this is a safe space where you'll be able to share. And if you are concerned about like, well, I don't want to say anything because I know this person at this library, that you'll also be able to email me ahead of time so that if you want to remain anonymous, we can do that as well. And I'll be sharing how to do that at the end of today's session. So it's going to move by, the next week is going to go by very quickly, and I'm looking forward to spending a lot of time with all of you. Um, so first today, we're going to talk about job descriptions. And the life cycle of an employee really begins with a well-crafted job description, because the well-crafted job description reflects what job it is we're asking someone to do. It sets the framework for your employee's tenure. Um, during their however long they stay at your library. And if you don't take away anything else about job descriptions, my hope is that you know by the end of today that having a strong job description will help in every other area of your employee life cycle. So, what is a job description? Well, a good job description is the foundation and it outlines what knowledge people bring to the table, what skills, what abilities are necessary to perform the role. And it lays out the essential functions of what the employee does. Now, a lot of times people are like, oh, it lays out every single thing the employee does. No, it highlights the areas where the employee spends the majority of their time. In fact, for most job descriptions, 70 to 80% of an employee's job can be summed up in like 3 to 4 items. And so I'm curious, talking to those of you in the chat and that are joining us here today, how many of you have a current job description that lists what your job is and what you're supposed to be doing and what knowledge and skill you need to bring for that job? You can go ahead and share in the chat. My job description, we just updated all of ours last year with the salary benchmarking project. So I'm really excited because I have a very up-to-date job description, which is something we've been meaning to work on for several years. So I'm curious if any of you have an up-to-date job description. Yay, Margaret does at her library. That's a wonderful thing. That's great to hear. And if you don't, that's also okay. Um, and Kathy has a new one because she was just hired. Yes, this is great. I'm happy to see so many yeses, because I often find when I'm presenting that people are like, oh, ours are like 10 years old, or they're 15 years old, or oh no, we don't have job descriptions, which is also okay. Because I'm going to take you through what should be in a good, solid job description. So the heading of your job description is pretty basic, right? It's going to talk about what is the position title. Now, often people get confused and think like, oh, I'm writing a job description for the person, but you're actually not. The job description is meant to be for the position that you need, the work that you need done. Um, and so you also want to put who the person reports to. Do they report to the board? Is it a manager that reports to the director? Now, some libraries are smaller, so you might only have a couple staff, or you might be the only staff member. It's still good to put who that person reports to, because chances are, even if it's just you're the only employee and you report to the board, it's still good to list that out. There's two other things in the heading, though, that are important to put. 25% of public libraries across the country are have staff that are in unions, or I should say 25% of library employees in public libraries are part of a union. Your library might be part of a union, or you might not be. If you are, you want to make sure that you list that and list if the position is part of the union. You also want to list your FLSA status. This is your Fair Labor Standards Act, which we're going to talk more about when I get into the legal section of today. But this is where you're going to list whether an employee is exempt or an employee is non-exempt. This is one of the most confusing things that I find come up in libraries of should an employee be exempt? Should an employee be non-exempt? And the federal government, the Department of Labor, has very strict rules for when someone can be exempt because they would prefer to have everyone be um, non exempt, that they would be eligible for overtime compensation, that they would be eligible, that they wouldn't, if they worked over 40 hours a week, that they would be allowed to have, they would have to have time and a half or compensatory time. So in their mind, being exempt is a big deal. For most libraries, um, I find that they often have librarians that are classified as exempt, and they may or may not actually be. So if you are ever in doubt, there's a lot of information on the Department of Labor website that gives you like a test that you take that's basically a series of questions like, do they meet this criteria? Do they make at least this much money? Do they, do this type of job? Do they supervise people? And there's all these different questions that they ask, and you have to be able to answer yes to every single one in order for someone to be classified as exempt. So when you are not sure, the most generous thing you can do is to make your employees non-exempt. My husband used to work for Whole Foods and he worked in a management position and he was non-exempt. And that often surprises people because they're like, well, maybe that isn't that big a deal. Like, I mean, I think that if you're a manager, you should be exempt. And the short answer is they decided that the most generous thing they can do as an organization, as a business, was to make sure all of their employees received appropriate pay for the hours they were working. So their staff, except for their store managers, were all non-exempt, even all of their department managers. So this is the heading. Now I'm going to give you an example. I used to be a children's librarian, so we're going to use that as our example today. And so a heading in a job description might look like this, where it says you're a children's librarian, you're a non-exempt position, this position is in a union, and they report to the children's manager. Now, I like to have a separate section, which I don't see on a ton of job descriptions, but I think is really helpful. Requirements for all employees. This is going to be exactly the same on every job description in your for your library. This is where you put items that you expect every employee in the organization to adhere to. This would cover things like maybe you have core technology requirements, or there's customer service expectations, or maybe everyone has to work an evening or a weekend shift. Um, Thinking about that, what are some things that you would say at your library are things that you want to have everyone do? You can go ahead and type in the chat, what are some requirements for all staff that you have, whether it's written in the job description or not? Or what are some things that you'd like to have in as a requirement? And yeah, and Margaret's asking a great question. Can the requirements be a separate document that are referenced in the job description? Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to show you an example in just a minute on ours. We say that they have to adhere to our service standards, and our service standards are then attached to that. So we don't have to list them all there. Um, yeah, Lorena, I love that. Offer patron services with empathy and respect. Yeah, you don't want just some departments to do that. You want everyone in your library that's interacting with patrons to do that. I love that. So Here are some examples of some things that we've done that we have in our job description at my library. We tell people they have to not only be able to work effectively with patrons, but also with other staff and their supervisors. We know that they need to use different technology, like we need everyone to be able to check their email. We need them to be able to follow our policies, and we need them to know that the environment is going to be changing. And so by having these as something in all of our job descriptions, we make it really clear that these are the priorities for our library. Next up in the job description, you want to put in a position summary. This is essentially like an elevator speech for the position, and it should give you a really clear idea of what is in the job, what the position entails. So this is what you would put in, this is what we put in for one of our children's librarian positions. And you can see immediately it talks about providing, reference and reader's advisory, doing programs, buying materials. And so it gives them a high level overview of what the position is going to include. Then you get into more detailed knowledge about what are the requirements for this position. Now, this is not the work being done yet. You're not saying, oh, you're going to do collection development or you're going to plan story times. This is what knowledge and skills and abilities do they need to come with in order to be able to be successful. Now, in my library, we keep things pretty uniform. So almost all of our librarian job descriptions have similar requirements, but there might be slight tweaks based on what each one, what department they're in. Um, so we say knowledge of department collections and resources instead of saying children's, so that we can use the same wording in our adult and our youth librarian job descriptions. We know that they need to have knowledge of our integrated library system, our ILS, our catalog. We want them to understand what the reading interests are. You might have very different requirements. One of the things that for us is really important. We're a larger library. We have an 87,000 square foot building. Um, and so we have a lot of service desks. So we need people um, to be kind of more subject matter experts in different areas. Your library might only have one or two service desks. You might need to have someone that's great with working with kids and also answering adult questions. Again, each of these is going to be dependent on the needs of your library. Then you're also going to have a category which might be included in the requirements for this position, or you might call it out separately for education and experience. And this is something that in the library world can be somewhat of a touchy subject, especially when it comes to what level of education are you requiring. Now, I have a sample here that this position requires a Master's of Library and Information Sciences. One of the things that we've been doing when we updated all of our job descriptions at my library last year is we've actually adjusted the wording and we said we are looking for people with the following skills that are often gained from acquiring a master's of library science, because we recognize that not everyone is able to get that master's, that there's a high cost component, there's just a time component, but that they might have learned skills elsewhere. And in talking with my management team, one of the things that I was most surprised at was that when we started talking about, oh, this position has to have a bachelor's. Well, what skills do we require that we think that they're coming in already with? No one was on the same page. Everyone had different ideas of what people were bringing in based on what they themselves had learned in their traditional schooling. So this is where you want to think about what do you actually need for the position. Um, and maybe you do need to have the master's, or maybe you need to have someone that has a really good knowledge of children's literature and child development. That's going to be up to each individual library what the needs are. We also made the choice to remove the number of years of working with people in the job description. So you'll see it says here, experience working with children. This is something that if we were saying like, well, you have to have at least 10 years experience working with children, if you really require that, put it in. But if you're going to look at an application and the application only has someone with 3 years experience, but you would consider hiring them, you want to think for the job description, what is the minimum level needed? You're not talking about who is the person in the position now. You're talking about who would I be willing to hire that would have the minimum qualifications necessary to be successful in this role. And this is really important because when we talk about creating libraries that reflect our communities and that have a lot of different lived experiences with people, we want to think about what are we actually asking for and what is realistic. It's kind of like, entry level position, but we require 5 years experience. Well, then it's not an entry level position. And I think we sometimes just copy and paste things from previous job descriptions and just keep them in there without having paused and said, is this really necessary? I know that's something I've been trying to be a lot more thoughtful about to encourage people to come in and work in libraries and that you don't have to have either formal schooling for everything or that you have to have all of this experience in order to be successful in the role. So once you've outlined all of the different requirements, this is where you get to what the duties are. This is what I think of when most people think of job descriptions. They think of what are the duties? What are the essential functions? What are the things we're asking the person to do on a day to day basis? And like I said earlier, we there's only three examples here, or three things that are here. Most jobs can be summed up um, in just a few bullet points. Uh, this is where people are spending the majority of their time. Yes, are there some additional things that could be listed? Sure. But essentially, a children's librarian is going to work the service desk and answer questions, do programming, and do collection development. Those are the three main areas of focus at my library that we have them working on. Um, you'll also notice in this, it does not specify what areas they're doing collection development for. So it doesn't say, oh, they're going to be, purchasing picture books or juvenile readers. It just says collections, because then again, you don't have to change it if you move collections between people or you shift who's doing what. This allows you to have more uniformity across your different job descriptions. This is also going to be helpful if you ever do a formal benchmarking study because they charge you for every job description you have. And so, say you have three children's librarians, which would be a lot, but like let's just say you do, and each has their own job description. Each of those would be benchmarked differently versus you have three children's librarians and one job description that can be used for all three, then you're only benchmarking once. So you can save a little bit of money that way, which I find to be really helpful. So these are, as I said, very generic. Not your library might have slightly different things. I know some libraries where you have people that just work on collections, and then you have people that just do programming. Again, depending on what your library needs, you want to stop and think, what are those high level things that we're having them spend the majority of their time on? It doesn't mean that they're not doing other things, but that these are the main buckets that people are putting their hours worked into and spending time doing. The last thing that you want to make sure you have in the job description that's really important is physical requirements. Every job description should include these, but some job descriptions might have a more robust listing. This is really important, and we're going to talk about this later today when it comes to workers' compensation. And if someone has an accommodation request, you want to have clear requirements in here of what is needed. So these are the common words that we often see used in physical requirements. it might say something like, must be able to stand for 4 hours at a time at a service desk, or must be able to lift up to 25 pounds. Um, these words, though, are not always very inclusive. So when we think about people that might have disabilities, these are words that often, if they read them, they'll assume that this is a hard and fast rule. So, can anyone think of other ways that you could say some of these words? Like, what's another way to say walk or carry or lift or stand or sit? Um, if you have any ideas, go ahead and toss them in the chat. This is a hard thing to like, it's kind of retraining our brain and how we're thinking, but is a good exercise to think about what words are we using and how are they maybe restricting what people might think. um, I like this, Margaret, that we have reasonable accommodations may be made to enable individuals with disabilities to perform the essential functions. um, that is, yeah, I'm going to give you next week some different wording to use. But basically, you want to say, are they able to perform these with or without um, a reasonable accommodation? And so, yeah, I can give you some new wording for that next week. Um, Yes. Yes. Lorena, like not stand, but sitting at a circ desk. Right. Like if someone is in a wheelchair, that doesn't mean that they can't work a service desk. It just means that they can't stand. Um, so there's this great site that I found that I have the link to on the bottom here, and you'll get a copy of all of the slides here. Um, so instead of saying like stand or sit, you can say remain in a stationary position, or instead of saying walk, you can say move or traverse. Um, these are things that, again, you can start thinking about how can we make our language more inclusive when we're writing things. So like maybe someone doesn't need to carry a box, maybe they can put it on a cart and push the cart. So thinking about the different ways that we use language, um, I've become a little bit addicted to Chat GPT. And one of the things that I've been enjoying doing is taking words that I'm like, I'm not quite sure I'm getting this right, and saying, acting as like an accessibility consultant, tell me different wording I can use that would better, that wouldn't be ableist, that would better convey this in a more inclusive way. Um, yes, yeah. Asher, I love that you said that. So they're saying here that as someone, they found it's more encouraging when a description specifies the physical task needed. Attending the circ desk. That's a great way of putting it. It's a positive way of doing it instead of saying, it's not telling people, it's kind of like, so I had this horrible example of when I started at my library. We had a cert clerk job description that was 4 pages long. It actually wrote out how to check books in and out, like open the cover, scan the barcode. I'm like, no, 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 no. So we want to tell people, what do we need to have accomplished? We need to be able to serve the patrons at the desk. You need to be present at the desk. But instead of saying you must do it this way, we're saying this is the end result we need, and you can tell us the best way, you know, that it's going to be done. I like, yeah, Ashley, thank you. That was a great suggestion for alternative ways of approaching this. So once you've reached the physical requirements, you hopefully have completed now a really solid job description. But just as with anything, there are some things that you should make sure that you never do in a job description. And so I often find that people will list a higher level of skill than is needed. List the actual level. It should be the minimum level needed to successfully perform the job. So if you need someone, like I said, that has a bachelor's degree, make sure that that is actually required. You also, this is an easy thing, trap to fall into, putting the requirements based on the current person in the position. Oh, well, so and so has been in the position for 20 years and they're great, and we want someone else that's equally great. Okay, but are you, one, going to be able to pay someone for 20 years experience coming in? And is that really the minimum needed to do the job? Um, you also don't want to put every single task performed. As I mentioned, we had a 4-page cert clerk position. It said how to check in books. No, no, that was too much. You do want to consider having like a duties list that you let people know who does what. And we're going to talk about that next week when we talk about onboarding employees so that they know, oh, I'm also not only responsible for buying picture books, but for doing the displays every month, highlighting a different topic. Great. It also is really important. I've seen a ton of job descriptions that don't have any physical requirements. Please don't forget to put those in. And as we already talked about, don't put how to do a task. You want to put put what task needs to be done, but not telling them how it needs to be done. So when we talk about job descriptions, why did we just spend half an hour talking about job descriptions? You're probably like, this feels like too much. They tie into everything. So when you talk about compensation, your job description is what is used to benchmark what pay should be. When we have legal issues, your job description is the first thing you're going to go to if you have an ADA accommodation request, or there's a workers' comp claim, or someone is filing a lawsuit. You're going to first look at your job description. When we're talking about bringing people on and retaining staff, hiring, you're going to start with what work do we actually need to have done? That's going to help you write your job ad. When we're talking about onboarding an employee, you're going to talk about what jobs do we need to have them trained on? That's going to be based on the job description. When we talk about giving people feedback on the things that they're doing really well or the things that need course correction, you're going to be looking first to the job description and saying, how can the job description support the things that I need to give them feedback on? Then there's the tough stuff that we don't often like talking about, but often have to. This is the not fun part of being a manager. Sometimes there is some discipline that needs to happen. Your job description is going to be critically important in helping you hold people accountable for doing the work that you've asked them to do. If you have a termination where you need to um, uh, release someone from employment, your job description is going to be critically important in helping you put together documentation. And then when you think about the long-term needs of your library, your future planning, your succession planning, your job description is going to be where you start to help you plan out what is needed, and who might be able to fill in if you were to be out on leave or if someone departs unexpectedly. All of these things start with the job description. So if it seems like I am overemphasizing the job description stuff, it's because I am. I totally am. And because job descriptions really are so important, and they're the baseline for everything else that comes after. But we are going to turn because we do have two other really important topics to talk about today. And so we're going to turn to talking about policies. And while job descriptions are critically important, policies are also a key part of developing your HR infrastructure. Um, when you set clear expectations for employees, whether it's through a job description or through policies, you can use that. You use those as tools to help the employee be successful and to set your organization up for success. And so now we are going to be talking about policies and what policies we need to have, and what the role of a policy is in your organization. So I'm curious, when you think of the word policy, what comes to mind? How would you define what a policy is? Um, I tend to get a little wordsmithy with like how I define policies, and I'm always excited to hear what other people think. Um, so someone says, "Oh, I have a policy I need to create." What what does that prompt in your head? A guideline for standard setting? Absolutely. Guidelines 100%. The standard that is expected? Yes. Also, absolutely. Yeah. Any other thoughts that people have on what a policy is? I know this is a little scary, like, I don't want to say the wrong thing. There isn't necessarily a right or wrong. Directions on how to handle a situation or rules for the situation or space. Yes, I like that. I like that wording a lot. Um, yeah, absolutely. Does anyone a scaffold, um, guidelines that guide a procedure? Oh, Sue, yes. I love how you said that the guidelines that guide a procedure. One of my things that drives my staff nuts is that I'm very careful when I say policy versus procedure. The policy is approved by the library board. Our policy tells us what the expectations are. It provides key information. It sets a framework and it sets the stage for what type of organization our library is. Um, Ideally, they are clear and concise. A procedure is the instructions for staff on how to complete different processes in the library or for how to take a policy and operationalize it. And so a policy is really like everything you guys just said. It is the scaffolding, it's the structure, it's the framework, it is the overarching rules that are set by your board that help you run the library and manage people. And so, why does that matter? Well, policies, as we've already said, provide a framework and they help you know that you're being clear with your employees and what your expectations are, but it also helps your employees know what is expected of them. But there's a few other reasons that you need good policies. Um, you don't want to go to jail. I joke sometimes that like I don't want to go to library jail. I also don't want to go to real jail. And you want to make sure that you're complying with your state and federal laws. We're going to talk more about some of the federal laws today. Every state has slightly different laws as well. Vermont is no different. And so that is something that anytime you're thinking about your policies or updating policies or creating policies, you're going to want to check in with your attorney to make sure that you're not writing anything that violates any state laws. Because again, none of us want to go to jail. You also want to create good policies to create an expectation framework. It goes both ways. We are the employer, and our employees expect certain things of us, just like we expect certain things of them. Laying that out for them in a clear manner is super helpful. It also helps you create a healthier and more inclusive organization if everyone knows what the expectations are and they've been clearly defined. This will probably come as no surprise to anyone, but employees, while they may love working for the library, typically work in order to get a paycheck and benefits. And so the policy serves a really important role in providing what those benefits are. When we talk about compensation, we usually are referring to people's salaries, but benefits are a huge role play a huge role in keeping good employees at your library. Creating a one-stop shop where employees can access benefits that are available in the organization will help you get and retain really strong staff. Um, and so we're going to talk about some of the benefits that you might want to consider providing for employees. Now, when you are thinking about the policies you need to have, there's a number of different categories. Well, there's three. There's not a number. There's just three. It's guidelines, which a couple of people already mentioned guidelines, benefits, which I just spoke about, and conduct. Um, as part of the additional resources that Joy will be sending out to you after today's session, you will get access to my most updated employee handbook. So if you have a handbook that hasn't been updated in a while, and I should say, I call my personnel policies employee handbook. You might call it HR policies. You might call it personnel policies. It might be employee handbook. All of them mean the exact same thing. Um, and there are different categories that you need to look at when you have one, when you have a policy that you're putting in place or a handbook. And so I give you all access to the one I have. Do know that it is Illinois, and so some of the policies have things in there that are very Illinois focused. But it's meant to give you kind of a jumping off point if you don't have certain policies or you want to create certain policies where you don't have to write something from scratch. Libraries, one of the things I love most is that we're great about sharing information with each other. So um, and great question. If a library mostly runs on volunteers, yes, you still should have policies. Maybe it is more part of your general policies, but you'll need to have policies saying like, hey, if you're a volunteer, these are we still have expectations. We still have expectations about how you're going to interact with patrons. We still have expectations, and there's still laws that say like as a volunteer, you will not be paid. And it's good to put that in policy. Um, and so that would be something that, again, depending on the type of library you have and what your employee situation looks like, some of these might not be relevant. So let's look at what some of the policies are. So under guidelines, this is just a list of all of the guidelines. The red ones that I have highlighted here, these are ones that um, everyone should have. Uh, and these are things that are required by the Department of Labor or other federal laws. So an American with Disability Act, reasonable accommodation. Even though it's the law, it is recommended to have a policy outlining how someone can ask for a reasonable accommodation. You need to tell people if you are paying them, which if you have employees and they're not volunteers, you should be paying them how overtime works, what are the pay periods, how are payroll deductions taken out. Um, Almost every state is an at-will state, and so you want to put that your employment is at will. I believe Vermont is, and so that would be another thing that you want to say, which basically means that yes, we are an at-will state, so we can, if needed, terminate without any cause. There are also policies, though, that are not legally required, but that I would recommend having. An attendance policy is one, saying you expect that the people will show up on time and that if they don't show up, and you can, like we say, 3 days, if you're a no call, no show for 3 days, your employment is terminated. Um, you also want to talk about how you do rest and meal breaks. Is if someone leaves the library, are they eligible to be rehired? Do you have any dress guidelines? I know my library has gotten a lot more casual. Since COVID, we used to be more business casual, and now we're more just casual. And so you want to outline what your expectations are. Um, you should also have a progressive discipline policy, which we're going to talk about next week when we talk more about holding people accountable. But that is something that lays out what steps you will take if someone is not meeting the requirements for the job, if they're not performing. And so all of these are things that are should haves but aren't legally required. And then there are also policies like the open door communication policy that might be nice to have. It depends on your organization. At my library, we have one that talks about if an employee wants to talk to the library board, they have to go through steps. I mean, they can, as a member of the public, come to a board meeting, but they can't just go to a board member individually and be like, I don't like that Kate is doing this. They first have to check in with their manager. And if their manager can't resolve it, then they have to come to me. And if I can't resolve it, then they can go to the board. But it also is clear and lays out understanding that the board, an individual board member, has no authority. The board only has authority when they act together as a whole. And so this lays that out. So it's clear for the board, it's clear for me, it's clear for the staff, it's clear for the managers how that communication works. Again, that might not be something you need. So, um, and so there's a great question that's coming up in the chat about um, asking for mental health accommodations, and that there doesn't seem to be much agreement in how asking for a mental health accommodations um, works, and do I have any suggestions or resources that outline that clearly? Um, First of all, yes, I agree. Things are not like people can ask for a reasonable accommodation, but there's great resources, and we're going to talk in a little bit about that when we talk about the ADA on the ADA website. But I also really love the Job Accommodation Network, and the website is askjan.org. And that is something that is really helpful because what it is, created by the Department of Labor, and it says, hey, here is if someone is asking for a reasonable accommodation, here are some ideas of things you can do. Or it says, hey, person that might be asking for an accommodation, here are some things that you can advocate for. Most reasonable accommodations cost less than $300 to put in place. Most accommodations do not really require much. Unfortunately, the ADA is only 30 years old. It was created in 1992. It feels like it should be much older. Um, and so we as employers need to do a better job of creating space for our employees to ask for accommodations and to be willing to do that. I think that there still is some stigma. And so, and I this is changing, but it is changing slowly. So I feel your pain. And this is something that I think the more we can talk about it, if you can go in and ask, say, hey, I need this. This is what I'm asking for. I'll often have people come to me and say, hey, I'm asking for an accommodation, but they don't know what type of accommodation they need. And that's where the interactive process can be really, really helpful. And we can talk a little bit more about that if we want to do that more in our Q&A session at the end. Um, yeah. And so, great question. Does someone who has a mental health disability need documentation for asking for the accommodation? Um, Short answer, it depends. If someone you can ask for documentation, but oftentimes I think that I'm always of the mindset that I want my employees to be successful. So I want people to be asking for what they need to be helpful. So if someone's like, I really, I like, for instance, I am left-handed. A lot of pens smear. And so, like, there's certain pens that I just like to use. Um, is that an accommodation? No, but I just have those pens that I like because they don't smear when I sign checks. Um, we can do things to make it easier for people. We don't have to make them jump through a ton of hoops. It is up to us as the employer to say, what can we do to help ensure this employee's success? And so if someone is saying, well, if someone's saying, I can only work on desk for 1 hour a week and they're a full time employee, might not be. That's where you have a dialogue. But it is really scary because people know that by acknowledging that they have um, a disability or a mental health issue, or whether it's any type of disability, not even just mental health, maybe they're neurodiverse, it's really scary for them to come and say something. And a lot of resources online tell people like, don't disclose, because people do discriminate against people. And so recognize that if someone comes to you and says, hey, I'm having this issue and I need an accommodation, or I'm really struggling with this. I have ADHD and it would be really helpful if this, that they have just shown a tremendous trust in you. They have just shown that you are someone that they think is going to be willing to help them and not discriminate against them. Um, it's hard. And so we can talk a little bit more. I'm going to finish talking policies and we can talk about this a little bit more when we get into the ADA stuff. There isn't a short, quick, easy answer to things. Um, but I think that the more we can model that we accept people for who they are and show people that we're creating safe environments for them, the better off we'll be as organizations. All right. So other categories, benefits. these are things that employees receive from us besides a paycheck. As I said, this is really important. There are certain things that we legally have to provide, such as workers' compensation and COBRA and FMLA. Um, most I meant to check Vermont. I forgot to check on the jury duty stuff and witness duty. Most states have requirements that you can't like fire someone if they get called for jury duty. There's also federal military leave requirements. There's also some state level things. So this is something that someone can really, these are all policies that you should have in place that are legally required benefits. But then there are other things that are just nice to offer. One of my dreams is to be able to offer paid caregiver leave. So right now, my library has paid parental leave, which is awesome. So when someone has a child, or they adopt a child, or they're fostering a child, the parents get 6 weeks of paid time in addition to their regular vacation time, et cetera. And so this is something I'd love to be able to offer for some of my employees that have older adults that they're caring for. Maybe they have aging parents, and being able to offer paid caregiver leave is a dream I have. So I always put it on here, as a, oh, I did the wrong one. I put it on here as a dream for someday. And so this is something that, um, these are like nice to have, but there are other things like offering vacation time and sick time. We are near a train station, so we offer a commuter benefits plan. So you want to think about what are some of the value added benefits you can offer employees. Maybe you have a tuition reimbursement, um, that you can offer people. Those are all things that will help you to retain strong employees. And having policies in place that tell them what they get is, again, really helpful so they don't have to guess. Like, I don't know, will you pay for my ALA membership? Like, yes, we will. Here you go. The last category is conduct. This is how we expect staff to behave as an employee, and it outlines behavior that is also not acceptable. This is really critical in creating a safe workplace and for holding staff accountable for their actions. We were talking about ADA and mental health, and creating an environment where people feel safe is challenging. And we have a duty to outline what our expectations are and then to use what we've outlined to hold people accountable. There are some legal requirements of things that you should have, like anti-bullying, a drug and alcohol-free workplace, the whistleblower compliance. The things that I have highlighted here are all must-haves in terms of your requirements. But then there are other things that are should-haves. So you want to have a standards of conduct. Um, so this is something that, again, you might not need to have some of these, but these are ones that, if you have staff that use their personal vehicle, if they're doing outreach or maybe doing home deliveries or visiting schools, you want to put in there what is required. Like, we will reimburse you for that. And you have to make sure that you're, driving safely and wearing your seatbelt and those kinds of things. And so there's also, oh, I meant to hide this slide. You can just ignore this. This is already ones that we've covered. There's also, and thank you for asking the question in the chat right before I was going to get to it. Um, how do I get help doing this? Personnel policies are challenging. I love writing policies, which is why I'm going to share my policy manual with all of you. My policy manual has been reviewed by an attorney, but do know, again, like I said, it's an Illinois, municipal attorney. So you're going to want to ask your attorney, to look over any policies. The laws change. I would say that generally every year we have at least one or two personnel policies that change because of laws that have changed at the state or federal level. This does cost money. I recognize not everyone has money to spend on an attorney. It For our review for our personnel policies, it cost us between $1,500 and $2,000 for our attorney to review it. That is an existing policy manual that they're just reviewing, not creating any. But many attorneys will also send out samples if a new law has been passed to libraries. So if you have an attorney, I would encourage you to find out if that's something they do, or that they typically have a repository of other ones that they've written. And so you might be able to see samples. It is a lot of work. And so in terms of updating your current employee handbook without editing it yourself, unfortunately, you're going to have to probably do some editing yourself. Um, and this is something that some libraries decide that they have a library policy committee that a part of the library board sits on. I use my management team. I'm lucky enough to have an HR manager. So we also work on writing policies. Um, and so it is a lot of work. It took me, I would say, when I first started at Northbrook, um, they had just started reviewing the policy manual, and it took a solid year to review it, including having the attorney vet it and having the board approve it. So I find the best thing to do is to pick one or two policies every month, if yours hasn't been updated in a while, that you look at a board meeting. I did this with my library board at my last library, and we would just look at a couple every month. And then at the end of the year, after we'd gone through everything, we had the attorney look it over in total. Um, it is always going to be a living document. It's always going to be something that you need to be continuing to look at. You want to update your policy manual every 3 to 5 years, and more frequently if you have a lot of laws changing in your state. Another thing that you can do to ask for help in this is thinking about different consultants. There are a lot of policy. There's one called um, GovHR, and they do a lot of different types of work, but they do consulting work and will help write policies for you. They're actually based here in Illinois, but they work nationally throughout the whole U.S. But creating an equitable organization is really important to me, and I'm assuming to all of you. The personnel policy is your first baseline for making sure your employees have a shared understanding of what is and is not acceptable. If you have money and can, bringing in an equity, diversity, and inclusion consultant to help you review policies for inclusive language will be really, really beneficial. If you can't do that, because again, money, um, I totally get it. And here's some things that you can do that can help you vet your policies and make them more equitable and inclusive. So the first thing you want to do is you want to think about the words that you're using. One of the things that we did in our last update of our employee handbook, was we removed any gendered pronouns. So we no longer said he/him or she/her. We just said they, them, or you can skip pronouns entirely and just say the staff member, the employee. When you are thinking about how you're defining different populations, there are federally protected classes of people, including race, creed, color, national origin, religion, marital status, gender identity, physical, sexual orientation. These are legally protected classes. You want to have a list, and there's often policies where you're listing different populations. Make sure those lists are consistent. Questions that I ask myself when I'm writing a policy: will my staff feel represented by the language used? Have you used language in a policy that centers one identity more than others? Like, do you have a paid maternity leave instead of a paid parental leave? Um, we also know that Black women have been told for decades that they cannot wear their hair naturally. Illinois just passed a law last year, finally, prohibiting discrimination, but making sure that your policies don't have dated language that discriminates against groups. There was a dress code policy that I saw once, and it said in the policy, women must wear bras. Now, I always do. I always do wear a bra, but like, the fact that that was in the policy and that there was nothing about what men needed to wear in terms of undergarments was pretty eye-opening. Was like, oh, this policy hasn't been updated since like the 80s. So think about how you've worded things, and even if you aren't the best writer, um, as I mentioned, addicted to ChatGPT. I've been testing it and trying out different things to try things. I have found that asking it to ask as a like HR professional, here's the policy I wrote. Can you make any recommendations? So asking it to kind of give you suggestions will be really is a really helpful thing to do. Not as the be all end all, but just to help kind of for my brain to help think of other ways to word things. You can also think about what your library's core values are. When you think about your library's culture and the values and the type of organization you want to have, like for my library, we are very strong around teamwork, collaboration, equity, inclusion. Policies are a great opportunity to reflect those values. Um, for instance, if your library says that they value work life balance, but you don't have a time off policy, are you really respecting work life balance? For me, one of my personal core values is lifelong learning. And I make sure to emphasize that in our continuing education policy. I want to make sure that staff know how important that is to us as an institution of lifelong learning, that we support lifelong learning for all staff. Um, and so, um, Yeah. Oh, Asher. I can't believe I'm so sorry to hear that at your last library they had the same requirement. Wow. That was that I'm sorry that I'm sorry to hear that that is still a thing. Um there's plenty of opportunities for updating policies, right? And that leads to my last thing, which is we all have our own bias. Um, I grew up in the Midwest. I am obviously like a middle aged white woman, and my experiences are the ones that have shaped who I am and how I look at the world. But someone else might have a very different set of experiences. We all have assumptions. And how we have lived through the world shapes how we look at things. And so when you are thinking about policies, thinking about all of the different identities that you yourself hold, you're bringing assumptions to the table, just like every other person at your library. And think about how those assumptions might be informing how you're writing things. Um, one of my one of my most eye-opening things as a manager happened when I had a staff member that was on an ALA committee, and she had to go to a midwinter, and she came to me and she said, I can't go to midwinter. And I'm like, oh, why not? Like, I thought we filled out all the paperwork and sent it up to administration. She's like, well, I have to pay for the plane ticket and hotel and then get reimbursed after, and I can't afford to do that. And I was like, oh, I'm like, well, let me go talk to them. And I went up and I said, hey, she's on this committee, in order to stay on the committee, she has to go, but she can't, can we just pay for it? And then instead of having her get reimbursed. And they were like, no, we can't do that. But we can try to expedite the thing. We usually make people wait until after the conference and then take 60 days, but we can expedite it and get it done more quickly. And so I said, well, I'll see. And I went down. She's like, I can't afford to do that. And and so she left the committee, didn't go to the conference, and it devastated me that I couldn't do anything to help her. The person up in the business office was like, well, I mean, it's not that big a deal. Just tell her to put it on her credit card and then she can just pay it off. Like, you're making a lot of assumptions that one, she has a credit card, two, that she has room on the credit card to do that and that she wouldn't get a hit. Like, there were so many assumptions baked into that, and it was painful. So when you think about policies, it's really important to think about how your own way of looking at the world is impacting what you are putting down on paper. And just remembering that how people are reading it is shaped by their own experiences as well. So when you do these things, you will hopefully help create policies that are going to be um, creating the type of environment you want to have as a library. Um, when you create policies, just like job descriptions, these are things that you're going to use all the time. You're going to use them when you're doing training. You're going to use them in different legal matters. You're going to use your policies when you're determining like raises and compensation for staff and how you handle that. Your policies impact how you do hiring and onboarding and how you give feedback and even how you discipline and if there's a termination and thinking about succession planning. All of these play into how you can use the policies day to day. So I have a binder. I keep my policies printed out and I have a ton of little sticky notes on it with different notes because I will often, if I'm talking to someone, I'm like, well, let's just see what the policy says. And then I'll say, okay, and here's how we've interpreted that in the past. And we've outlined, like, this is what, when we said this, this is how we have implemented it. And so having that is another really strong tool in your HR toolkit. And we're going to spend the last part of today talking about legal. Now, there are a lot of different aspects that you need to think about when it comes to HR and legal. And there are some basic laws that you need to know. I'm going to go through these pretty quick because I want to talk more about some of the scenario stuff. Um, but these each of these websites, you could spend days, weeks, months with what I'm going to share, like learning about all of these things. But also know that you do not have to be a subject matter expert on any of these. The key here is to know that a website exists, to know that there are resources out there where you can get help. And so the first is the ADA. As we've talked about before, the Americans with Disabilities Act was created in 19 or passed and signed into law in 1992, and it provides guidance and protections for people with disabilities. Those that includes both visible and invisible disabilities. There's a ton of great resources on here. There's training modules and different things if you want to do a deeper dive into ADA. EEOC is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Their role is to provide protection against discriminatory employment practices. This is really important because if you are, this is also a policy that you're going to want to have that I mentioned. This is something that their job is to protect employees and make sure employers are not behaving, and not just employees, but potential employees, like people that you're interviewing, as well as former employees. So it covers the whole gamut. I often hear people talk about, like, well, what about HIPAA? HIPAA applies to providing protection of an employee's health information. Unless your library runs their own insurance plan, meaning like you have access to confidential employee health information, we do not have to comply with HIPAA. But we do have to comply with different privacy laws. So I guess more just know that HIPAA is for medical professionals, and unless you are managing your employee health plan, you're probably not going to have to comply with it. And so um, OSHA is something that I think we don't often think of with libraries because we often think of it in terms of um, safety in physical fields, right? Like in construction and manufacturing. But they provide guidelines and regulate protecting employees in the physical workplace. My library's chiller went down last week, and we had our building temperature crept in certain parts up to the 80s. OSHA covered that. They said if your employees cannot be in an environment that is at least 74 degrees or cooler, you need to move them or send them home or blah, blah, blah. So OSHA does still apply, and it applies not only in terms of physical safety, but also in terms of just like the temperature, access to water, access to a bathroom. I was at a library once where the bathroom went out of order, and we had to close the library because we couldn't give employees access to a bathroom. And so we were not allowed to stay open. So there's a lot of different things with OSHA that you um, might want to think about or go and take a look on their website. We already talked a little bit about the Fair Labor Standards Act, but this essentially lays out um, under the Department of Labor how employees are paid for overtime. And that is something that is really important that we get right. Another law under the Department of Labor is the Family Medical Leave Act. And this is something that, as units of local government, we do need to comply with. And so, this is something that gives employees unpaid time off for medical, not emergencies, but long-term medical needs. So if someone is pregnant, they take FMLA leave. If they're out because of a surgery, if you're caring for someone, you also are going to be covering it. So it's to care for themselves or a family member, and it defines what family member means in the event of health issues, birth, and adoption. And so, great question. If you're sending employees home because the AC isn't on in working order, do those employees get paid? I feel very strongly that if we are telling an employee, no, you may not continue working, that we should continue paying them because we are taking away the choice from them to work. We are saying we cannot keep you here in this building. And so instead, we tell them that they have to go home. So yes, just like we close when we close for like winter weather, if it's not safe on the roads, we pay employees because we are taking away their choice. And for holidays, I we do have a holiday policy, which you'll see in our policy handbook, and we pay anyone that is scheduled to work on that day. So if it's a Monday and you work every Monday evening, we're going to pay you for that holiday. That was not always the case, but to me, I feel like if I am the employer am deciding for you whether you can or cannot work, then I should be paying you. Because if you would choose to, like, you might choose to come in on the 4th of July and maybe you don't like fireworks. But if I'm telling you, no, you cannot, we're closed, then um, I should be offering to pay. But that's my personal philosophy and that my board agrees with. And so that's the policy that we have passed. There isn't a legal requirement that you do that. So, thinking about some of the laws, one of the most important things that you can do is use an attorney. I was very nervous at my first library, which had a very limited budget. We had $2,000 a year set aside for any legal things, and which is about 10 hours of legal work where I am. Um, People often avoid using the attorneys because of the cost. However, not using them can often cost your library more in the long run. So I'm curious to hear in the chat whose library has an attorney that you use, or maybe you have no clue. Like, I don't have any idea if we have an attorney or not. My library is lucky. We have a firm that we work with that has different types of attorneys. We have HR attorneys and like people that help us with contracts, and so they have like a whole suite of lawyers. And so someone uses the town attorney since they're part of the town. Okay, and so not sure, town attorney possibly. I strongly recommend getting an attorney. Now, the good news about an attorney is that it is not like having a spouse. With spouses, you can only have one, and you kind of have to stick with that one, right? Um, with an attorney, you can have many attorneys. It's like having a group of friends. Like, hey, I have this attorney that we call when it's this thing, and this attorney that we call. But you do want someone that has either a municipal background or an HR background because there are laws that, oh, Kevin, this is great to hear. Many municipal libraries have access to an attorney through the Vermont League of Cities and Towns. Um, that's great to know. So if you are not sure, if you fall into that, reach out to Kevin or Joy and they can hook you up and let you know. Um, because having an attorney is really helpful. And so what kinds of things do they do? Well, we've already talked about one. They'll review your policies for you and make sure that you're not saying anything that is in opposition to any laws. They can help you if you're doing a termination. We're going to be talking about this next week. But if you are doing a termination for the first time, having them review your documentation and walk you through the process is going to be really helpful. Like I had one the first time I had to do a termination, it was so helpful. And I just felt it didn't feel good to do it, but it felt better knowing that I was following the steps. If you get sued, then that is when you're going to contact an attorney. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. If you have someone make a discrimination claim, that is another time that you should reach out to your attorney. You might also have insurance for that, and you might end up working with a different attorney through your insurance company. Um, Anyone, current staff member, former staff member, or even prospective employee can sue the library for discrimination. This is why having an attorney that you already have a relationship with or that you know who you're going to contact will make it less scary if something like this ever happens. And they're well worth the money that are spent on them. If you are not sure how to handle an ADA request, an attorney can help with that. There's an interactive process. As I mentioned, the Job Accommodation Network, the askjan.org, is a great website, but you might sometimes just want to talk to someone. Your attorney can walk you through that process. Um, so, so yeah, that is having and not assuming that you're going to have an attorney. There's a great comment in the chat that this just came up that they thought the town attorney would cover them and then it didn't. And so they're using the attorney with the League of Cities and Towns. Knowing before you have an emergency who your attorney is really, really helpful. And the scariest thing that often happens to people is getting sued. And so what happens? You just receive a letter informing you that you or your library is being sued. It is terrifying. I have had this happen and have lived through this. So I can tell you what I recommend doing, which is first, take a breath. It is scary. It is a lot of legalese. You just need to take a beat, read the document through, and then call your attorney. There are often time limits when you need to respond to a lawsuit. Getting your attorney the documentation ASAP, and the attorney might say, oh, do you have insurance? You might need to contact your insurance broker. Then, depending on what the lawsuit is about, you're going to want to gather all of your paperwork. The attorney, whether it's an attorney from your insurance company or the attorney, the town attorney, or another attorney, will walk you through the process. The key here is don't be afraid to ask questions when you are finding out what parts are. For me, I get really anxious when I don't know what's going to happen. And my way of making myself calmer is by asking questions and making sure I have a good understanding. So your attorney is going to want paperwork. They're going to want to know, like, give us copies of the job description, give us copies of the annual evals if it's a discrimination thing, give us copy of the workers' comp claim if if there's another claim. This will help them formulate a response. And so it can be really scary, but know that you don't have to figure it out alone, that attorneys, this is what they do, um, and they can help you. And so I hope that that makes getting sued a little bit less scary. I have a couple other topics that I want to touch on. I know we only have about 10 minutes left in our time today, but there are some other things that come up regularly. I'm not going to talk about unions today, but if any of you are in a union environment and you do want to talk a little bit more about unions, drop a note in the chat and we can add that in for the Q&A part next week. So workers' compensation. So workers' comp, we've talked about it from a policy perspective. This is a protection to employees who injure themselves on the job. An injured worker receives a portion of their regular pay while they are off for injury, and all of the medical expenses are covered by the library's workers' comp insurance coverage, not the employee's health insurance. The thing that I found most surprising in learning about workers' comp is that we, as the employer, do not decide if it is a compensable claim? Meaning, is it a claim that is valid? So let's say I have two examples from two different libraries. I had an employee who was walking in after her lunch break and tripped and sprained her ankle in the staff parking lot. And it was covered by workers' comp because she was on her way back into lunch, back in from lunch to her shift. I had another employee who, at the end of the day, was walking down a staircase and tripped and sprained her ankle. That was not covered. She was leaving work for the day, and they said no, she was already off the clock, and so therefore she is not covered. We, as the employer, don't get to decide whether or not the workers' comp claim is covered. The only thing that we need to do is to document what happened and then notify our workers' comp insurance. So if you, like, I didn't really know this when I was a manager. Like, if someone is injured, tell your director. Um, if you're the director, tell your workers' comp insurance. Now, I'm not talking about like, oh, I got a paper cut. I'm talking about someone fell and had to go to the emergency room, or like we had a staff member that accidentally cut off the tip of their finger. And that is, we had to call she went to the emergency room. If it requires medical intervention, then you should notify workers' comp, and then they will determine whether or not it's covered. The other thing that might come up is unemployment. All employers in every state pay into their state's unemployment insurance pool. When an employee is laid off through no fault of their own, they get to apply for unemployment and receive a weekly amount based on their wages for a specific amount of time. Every state does it a little bit differently. And in Illinois, even though it says like if someone is terminated because of failure to perform work, or I actually know someone that I know of a library where they had to pay unemployment after an employee stole from them, which I thought was really surprising. We also don't determine who does or does not get unemployment. I know it was wild. And so when just know that you have to notify your employee about the availability of unemployment. Um, each state has different requirements. In some, you have to give people a physical booklet. In some states, you have to, in others, you have to just make sure they're aware of it. It's all a whole thing. But for unemployment, know that we don't determine if the state says, nope, you're not covered. That isn't up to us. But we can, as an employer, say, we're not going to fight unemployment. We're not going to say, no, they don't deserve it. That is something that you can offer people if they're leaving. Now, we've talked a little bit about discrimination with a lawsuit, but know that discrimination, people don't have to use those words. And so when we think about discrimination things that happen, it's really important that managers are aware. If someone comes and says, so and so was saying things that made me really uncomfortable the other day about, or making really, jokes that I found really uncomfortable. That might be them saying, I feel like they're discriminating or harassing me. So know that people don't have to use the exact words. And it's a really good idea to um, keep good documentation. We're going to talk a little bit more about this when we talk about onboarding next week. But when you are bringing someone on, and you should hopefully have regular meetings with your employees, you want to make sure that you're jotting down things that they are saying, so that if you start to notice a trend like, oh, that's the third time they've mentioned this, that's weird. And then say, well, what kinds of things? And maybe I should bring this up to my director, or maybe I need to talk to the attorney about this. Developing an awareness of what people are saying is a skill that takes time to develop, but pay attention to clues that people might be dropping because they might not, most people aren't like, I am coming to you because so and so is harassing me by telling me inappropriate jokes. Oh, most of the time they'll say, I was just a little uncomfortable about this, or this was kind of like not great, or, or someone might say, I was talking to so and so and they were really um, bothered by something that this person said. And it's hard because there can be some interplay with things. That people have different things that bother them in different ways, but know that we should take all of those things seriously. And this is another good example of why having an attorney who can talk you through steps to take and conversations to have. Um, and then there's a really great question in the chat of what do you do if the director is the perpetrator of the discrimination? And I wish I could say that the world is a fair and just place. And unfortunately, it isn't. And that is why it's so important for all of us as managers and leaders or people who want to be managers are clear in laying out expectations and holding people accountable. Um, if you reported it to HR and nothing was done, another thing you can do, although I don't take this step lightly, is going to the board and saying, hey, this is happening. Um, and I want to bring it up. Legally, they have to follow it. But legally, are there any ramifications if they don't? If they don't adhere to, state and federal law? Um, I know that in Illinois, the Illinois Department of Human Rights, they receive on average 6,000 new complaints every year. That's just the people that are responding. And so this is, I want the world to be better. And I'm really sorry that that happened to Asher. That really, really sucks. And this is something that um, we all, as the people in positions of power, have an opportunity to push back and say, wait a minute, that's not okay. Um, One of the other best things you can do is go as a group. If it is one person it's happening to, have support. Like, yes, I've noticed it. Yes, this is, I saw them doing this as well. Or if it's happening to a group of people, going as a group, it's harder to say, well, wait a minute. No, it's just that person. It's like, oh, there's a group of people that are distinctly unhappy about this. So I know we are at time, and I know that I just shared a whole lot of information. You guys had some really, really amazing questions this week. So just as a quick recap, we talked about today laying the foundation. We talked about the importance of job descriptions, which again, I hope if you take nothing else away from this, you take away how they are critical to every part of the job. And we talked about policies. As I mentioned, you're going to get a policy handbook. Oh, and you're also going to get sample job descriptions so you can see those as well. Legally, we talked about some of the different laws to be aware of, as well as different things that you would want to contact an attorney for. Next week, we're going to be talking about how do you hire and train and keep staff. And then we're going to be focusing on how do you handle discipline situations and how do you say goodbye. Um, then we have one more session where it's just going to be Q&A, where it's all the stuff you guys want answers. So if you have you're welcome to bring stuff there, but if you would prefer to contact me directly and you want it to be more anonymous, you can email me at info@librarydirectorstoolkit.com. You can also find other resources on my website. And if you are interested in getting the book, you can buy it from ALA. It's also available on OCLC and you can just borrow it. So I hope that that was, I'm going to stop sharing just so I can see people a little bit better. I really enjoyed getting to get to know all of you in the chat some, and I have a few minutes if people have any follow-up questions that you wanted to ask right now, if that's okay, Joy. I don't know if you guys have another
No, that's great. There is a question in the chat from Margaret. Is there a new law that further defines discrimination that I think you hadn't gotten to?
Oh, okay. So there is not a thank you. I missed that one. Um, and so the in terms of defining discrimination, no, there isn't. It's still very vague. And I would say that most of the time, um, people are afraid, even though there's even though you can't, I'm trying to think how to like say this without coming across as just really sad. Um, if you are, um, if you are experiencing or have observed harassment or discrimination, there are strong laws in place. The laws are there, but the application of the law is inconsistent nationally. And so what I have found is that people are not necessarily like, yes, it's very clear, but then there aren't any teeth behind things, or it's very hard for there to be true ramifications. So I don't know if that fully answered. I don't know if that fully answered it. Did that?
I
'Cause
think
I'm not
Margaret's
seeing
still
that
here. Is there
question.
anything else, Margaret, that you want to follow up on with that? Okay, she might have already